Welcome to the CRS Elevation Certificate Training Series on how to fill out an elevation certificate correctly, specifically how to do it for CRS purposes. This is the second video in this series and will cover Section B of the form. For information on where to find a copy of the current elevation certificate form, what it's used for, and why it's so important to CRS communities, please refer to the first video in our series, How to Fill Out an Elevation Certificate Correctly, Section A. Section B captures all the map information related to the property the building is being built or improved on. The general rule about Section B is that all entries in this section are to be based on the current effective map for the community. Do not use preliminary map information or information from the previous firm when the building was permitted if a new one has superseded it. We'll explain that point a bit more towards the end of this video. Let's go through the fields. Besides a new formatting look, the new 2023 EC only has one real change in Section B. The 2023 EC split the old B1 into two fields now, but they are still capturing the same information. B1A is a CRS required field and is used to enter the community name of the community in which the building is located. It must be the correct community name. It doesn't have to be City of Orlando, it can just say Orlando, but make sure if it's supposed to be for the City of Orlando, it doesn't say Miami. And B1B is where you enter the 6-digit NFIP community number. It must be there for CRS purposes, and it must be correct. There is only one way to fill out these fields correctly. The correct community name must be in B1A, and the correct community number must be in B1B. If either of those fields are missing or anything is incorrect in these fields, it will be an error. An interesting thing to note for this section is that when a community annexes a piece of property, the NFIP number and name should reflect the number and name of the annexing community, not the one the property used to be in. You'll also need to show the correct map number and panel from the firm the information was taken from, meaning the other community's firm possibly if it's not a countywide firm. This usually comes into play when a community annexes a piece of land and then somebody builds on it. B1A and B1B should be the number and name of the community that the property is in now, but the rest of Section B will be filled out using the firm that's in effect for that property, which could be the other community's panel. If a community annexes land with buildings on them after they are built and you have the ECs for them, be sure to change the community number and name on the ECs and let the homeowner know that they can take the EC back to their insurance agent to make sure they are getting the correct CRS discount. Both B2 and B3 are not required for CRS. The information in B1 tells us exactly what community it is. The county and state are not needed separately. B4 and B5 must be filled out and filled out correctly since this identifies where on the firm to find the property in question. Both the map number and the panel number, 10 characters, must be in B4, while the suffix goes in B5. Most firms are now county-wide maps, so if you look at the firm for your community, you will see the full map and panel number down in the bottom right corner. It consists of the 5-digit community identification number for the county, then the letter C to indicate it's a county-wide map, and then the 4-digit panel number. The letter at the end of it, G, goes in the next field B5. If the suffix is in B4 instead of B5, we'll let it go, but to be done correctly, the suffix should be by itself in field B5. If the suffix is missing, or if the map and panel number or any part of it is missing, this is an error. It needs to be the correct map and panel number for where the building is located in the community. Many times we just see the panel number here. This is wrong. Make sure it's the full map and panel number. Now let's talk about B6. Since the firm index date will change each time there is a revision on any of the panels, it may not specifically apply to the location or the firm panel for the building. So field B6 is not required for CRS purposes. What is important is that we get the effective firm panel date correct. This is field B7. The date that is on the effective panel is the date to enter in B7. For the City of Orlando, you see the date is June 20th, 2018. This makes sure we are looking at the correct flood zone, base flood elevation, and any other information in the current effective firm panel. This must be a date, and the field cannot be left blank. It can be written out like this, June 20th, 2018, or in a date format like this, 6/20/2018. The flood zone in B8 is also required. This is important since the flood zone plays a critical role in determining whether the building is NFIP compliant or not. The flood zone for the building should be identified here, not the flood zone for the property. If a building is in an unnumbered A zone with no BFE determined, or an AO zone, the certifier should then be using sections E and F for the elevations and certification of the form. If a building straddles two different flood zones, be sure to enter both. Two or more flood zones can be entered, but for compliance purposes, know that the building will be subject to the most restrictive flood zone. If a building is in an AE zone, but most of the property that it sits on is in an X zone, AE is all that's required to be placed in the field. You do not need to have an X here, since it doesn't apply to the building. In any case, something must be filled out in B8 since there is a flood zone for every building. An entry in B9 is also required. Depending on the zone, you will use the flood insurance study profile, the floodway data table, or the firm to locate the property and enter the base flood elevation at the site for every building. In some cases where there is not a BFE, like in unnumbered A zones and AO zones, other entries are required. So let's break this down by flood zone. Numbered A and V zones will start with an A or V and be followed by a number or the letter E. For these zones, which will have BFEs, enter the BFE. For unnumbered A and V zones, where the BFE has not been determined, place NA in this field, and then place the elevations for the building in section E. For AO zones, enter the flood depth that's on the firm, and use section E for the building elevations. In both cases, for unnumbered A and V zones and for AO zones, the person certifying elevations should sign and date in section F. Now, the EC instructions say the BFE should be entered to the nearest tenth of a foot, since you should be using the flood insurance study or floodway data table to derive your BFEs. Please encourage all surveyors and engineers to do this, since this is the most accurate way to identify the BFE on the property. However, for CRS purposes, it is not considered an error if the surveyor just enters the BFE as a whole number that's on the firm closest to the building site. Often overlooked on an EC are the next three fields, B10, 11, and 12, and a new field with the 2023 EC, field B13. Be sure you are reviewing these fields when you see an EC from a surveyor. One of the boxes in B10 must be checked when a BFE is given in B9. B10 asks for the source of the BFE. In other words, where did the surveyor get the BFE from? This could be from the FIS profile or the firm itself. The community could have determined the BFE by doing a study themselves or approved an estimated BFE by someone else. If other is checked, it must be described in the blank next to it. Checking other, but then leaving that blank empty is an error. There is only one scenario in which B10 can be left blank and have no boxes checked. This is when a building is in an unnumbered A zone and no BFE exists for the building site. Otherwise, if this is left unmarked, it will be an error. It is also an error if more than one box is checked, as that is confusing for the reviewer. For community officials, if you are dealing with a building in the unnumbered A zone, contact your state NFIP office and see if they have base level engineering or any other best available data. Work with your state office to see if this can be accepted, and if so, if the surveyor can use this. If you do use base level engineering, you'll need to mark Other and explain its base level engineering you are using in the Section D comments box. Now let's move on to B11. The datum used for the BFE needs to be checked only when a BFE exists for the building site. Usually, if the firm or FIS profile is shown as the source for the BFE and B10 above it, it will either be in the NGVD 1929 or NAVD 1988 datums. Choose the correct one. And like B10 again, if Other is marked, it will be described in the blank next to it. Leaving it empty will be an error. One of the most common errors we see on ECs is when the datum shown here in B11 does not match the datum of the elevations given in section C2. So this field is very important to keep an eye on. Field B12 is not required for CRS purposes. While it is very important for insurance purposes, this field tells the insurance agent whether flood insurance can be written for this property or not. Insurance agents are all required to look this up for themselves on each policy on the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service website, so therefore it is not required for CRS purposes. And lastly, B13 is new with the 2023 form. While it is very important to know if the building is seaward of the limit of moderate wave action line, it is not required for CRS purposes. The LMWA line usually denotes a coastal A zone area when communities regulate development using this line, and it can have varying requirements to them. A local official may want to make sure this is completed accurately for their own purposes, but it is not required for CRS. As the NFIP evolves over time, this may be required in the next iteration of the form, so it wouldn't hurt to make sure your surveyors and engineers start completing this field now anyways. This brings us to the end of completing Section B. Before we look at the common errors we typically see in this section, we want to cover some general issues with Section B. The first one centers on how to fill out Section B when a building is permitted under a different firm than the firm in place once the building is completed. Remember the rule from the beginning of the video. Section B must always be filled out using the current firm's information at the time that the EC is signed and dated. This causes a little confusion for the certifier of the form when the flood zone or the BFE has changed during the period of construction. So, here's how to handle that and how ECs need to be filled out in these situations. Let's stick with our City of Orlando example and say that the information in the left column is the firm information for Orlando at the time that the building is permitted. The information in the right column is the firm information at the time the building was completed and the finished EC was signed and dated in 2023, right after their new September 20th, 2023 firm took effect. You'll notice that the BFE went up with a new firm. This might mean the developer built the lowest floor at 89 feet to satisfy the BFE at the time of permitting, but now that a new firm is in effect, it shows the BFE to be at 90.4. It looks like they have a compliance problem and will be charged higher insurance rates. Here's how to show that on the EC to make sure both a compliance reviewer and an insurance agent gets the correct story. The current firm information at the time the finished construction EC was signed and dated goes in the required fields in Section B. Be sure to also fill in B10 and B11. Then, in the Section D comments box, you would place all the firm information that was in effect at the time of permitting. Be sure the surveyor explains it and provides fields B1A, B1B, B4, B5, B7, B8, and B9. Now the EC clearly shows that the building met all requirements at the time of permitting, and it shows the current firm information. There are 3 common errors we see in Section B. The first one is wrong community numbers or names, or a name and number that don't match up, or this field is left completely blank. Please be sure both are entered correctly. This error is one of the most common we see across the country and really has an impact on whether or not the policyholder gets the correct CRS discount. B4 is a very common error. Here, we typically see just the first 6 characters of the map number, or just the panel numbers, or something other than the 10-digit full map and panel number that's supposed to be here. Please be sure the full map and panel number are entered in this field. And lastly, not filling out B10 and/or B11 seems to be fairly typical. Or one might be marked while the other is left blank. Another issue is that the datum in B11 does not match with the datum in C2. We'll talk more about that in our next video when we cover sections C and D. As a reminder, we will cover how to correct errors once you identify them in a separate training video called How to Correct an Elevation Certificate. Be sure to watch that video as well for the various ways you can fix an error that you see on an EC. That concludes training on how to fill out Section B of the Elevation Certificate correctly. Please go to the next training video in this series, How to Fill Out an Elevation Certificate Correctly, Sections C and D.